Hey, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you're coming to us from in the world. So this is our June Cybersecurity Insiders Perspective webinar, monthly webinar. This this webinar is kind of special. We're going to be talking about the hacker's perspective. I hate that word. We'll talk more about that in a moment. I kind of rather per se the attacker's perspective. I don't think hackers really exist, or if they do, they're fiddling with pies and neutrinos and other stuff. But what we've done in this presentation is a little bit different than what we've done in the past. We've got an agenda where we're going to go through different areas of how attackers think or what they do. For example, what's their motivation and what are they targeting when they either get into or after they get into your environment? What types of tools and tactics are they using, and how do they not get detected, or how do they get worried about detection, and how do they exfiltrate, and what can you do to prevent them, and where do we see attacks going to in the future? And as far as Q&A goes, there's no real script to this. In fact, this is, I said, very, very different than any of the CIPs or webinars you may have attended that I've run in the past, where we really are looking for your questions. So feel free to drop questions into the chat. Again, there's no script here. This is really kind of laid back and meant to give you an opportunity to speak to attackers. And speaking of that, I want to introduce you to my colleague, my friend, my compatriot, my brother in arms, Hector Montsegur. So with that, Hector, won't you kind of introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you're up to?
Sure. Hey everyone, ladies and gents, I appreciate all you guys attending and having me here and spending the next hour with me. That's awesome. My name is Hector Montsegur. I'm a director of research at a small VAR out of the West Coast. I am a security practitioner and enthusiast, overall nerd. You know, John and I can spend hours talking about security and issues with security and policy and all that. I enjoy it. It's one of the good. It's one of the few things in life that I'm actually pretty good at. So I enjoy talking about it. I have a podcast called Hacker in the Fed. I'm a co-host. And it's pretty interesting because there's one thing I've left out so far is that at one point in my life, I was the bad guy. I am a former adversary, former black hat. I was arrested. I was caught by the FBI. And my co-host on the podcast is the guy that arrested me, Chris Tarbell. You guys may also know him from his takedown on Silk Road. Aside from that, you know, I'm a strategic advisor to CloudWave and other security firms. I'm a good friend of John and his team. You know, one of the things that I want to touch on that really John just, mentioned a moment ago, which is this is a great opportunity for the audience here, for all of you, each and every one of you, to interact directly with a former bad guy. If you have any specific questions, feel free. I have no filters, so if you want to ask about black hat activities or methodology or scoping calls, if you're interested, if you want to do a pen test, hey Hector, if I bring in a vendor, how should I handle scoping, right? Any of those questions, just jump in. All right, John.
Awesome, thank you. So in order to just not hang out here, we did put together some questions that we're seeding, and we'll go through and kind of throw these out there and wait and see if anybody joins into the discussion. And also that, that's also fair game too. If you disagree with something we're saying or feel there's a different perspective, please feel free to put that out there as well. So let's talk about motivation generally, right? And ideology. So, Hector, why don't you get into kind of, I guess more importantly in your olden days, what was your motivation? What was your ideology? And what do you think today, attackers are thinking, and what motivates them and what drives them? And especially when it comes to attacking healthcare organizations and things like that.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, these are all great questions. It's a really good place to start. Now, as I mentioned, I'm a former black hat, so I was the bad guy at one point. And it may surprise you that my motivations initially were very different than what you may see from attackers today. In fact, John may remember this, but hacking, quote unquote hacking in those days, was really about curiosity and knowledge. For example, I became a Unix systems administrator in the early 2000s, like 2000, 2001, simply because I started quote unquote hacking. The first system I ever broke into was a Solaris system or SunOS back then. And that's how I learned how to operate Unix. Before then, I was just like a Linux, script kiddie. I had very basic knowledge. Um, Now, as time progressed, where I became really bad and went beyond curiosity, way beyond the hunger for knowledge, was when hacktivism, the concept, was coined in terms. Hacktivism in theory was already happening back in the 70s and 80s. There's plenty of stories of hackers breaking into a nuclear facility or hackers breaking into the Soviet Union and vice versa. But hacktivism itself, the name was used in the mid 1990s, and even when I participated in hacktivism, it wasn't towards a healthcare provider, for example. It was more geared towards a foreign government. Um, I spent most of my hacking days breaking into Russia or China, um, and mostly enemies of our country here in the United States. Um, Now, as you fast forward, motivations have changed. With the advent of cryptocurrencies, now attackers have the opportunity to make some cash, right? Prior to that, I think the earliest ransomware attack, for example, John, came in like the late 90s, and it required that you snail mail money to an address. I mean, that was a really crude attempt at getting money. I'm not even sure that worked. And if it did, then I'm sure the guy got in trouble. But yes, once you have the advent of cryptocurrency, motivation has changed completely, and obviously ideology and even methodology. So these are a great place to start. Now, if you want to touch on healthcare specifically, right? Healthcare as well as government networks, and John may remember this as well, was off limits for those scenes back in those days. Whenever you read a hacker e-zine or magazine, electronic magazine, one of the first things they would tell you is don't hack the government and don't hack critical infrastructure, right? Because that's terrorism. You're gonna go to jail. But now, since there's money involved, a lot of these young actors are young, John. They're not really thinking of the consequences. Well, hey, what if I ransomware a hospital? Well, from their perspective, they're not being affected, so they probably don't care. And that's the sad reality of where that whole hacking scene has turned into, where money trumps empathy, and that's a shame.
Yeah, okay. Well, first I want to go back to the first system I ever hacked was in high school, and it was a timeshare system. And the Solaris stuff you brought up brings me back. It shows my age, right? Because thinking of Scott McNeely and all the Sun Solaris stuff. But yeah, and I think that's why I purposely try to get people to think about the word attacker, right? Because kind of what was happening in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s was a lot of hacktivism and people trying to explore, and they'd stumble into something, and in many cases they pointed out security issues, and didn't try to exploit something negatively, right? Like causing someone damage.
Yeah,
Um, and the attack, I think the word attacker is really what we deal with today, right? Is somebody who's out to either do financial harm or physical harm, right? We've seen cyber munitions for a while in Miami. I was just talking to somebody yesterday about this. There used to be a conference. I don't know. I don't think it's there anymore, but I think it's moved to Malta or Morocco. But there used to be a conference in Miami um, every year where people would come in and trade cyber munitions, not trade them, sell them. Right? There was a whole market, and it was like a 4 or 5 day event, and it was very high level. People wore tuxedos and watch, you know, MMA fights, and it was eventually I think it got moved out, but that's changed the world that we're in. The I think the other thing around nation states, right, is very interesting. We've seen, and there is a good amount of hacktivism that still occurs today. We've seen the Ukraine, for instance. There's a whole volunteer hacking force that has been trying to help the Ukraine against Russia. Unfortunately, with all this stuff, right, once whether it's for good or bad, once the technique gets out there, it's going to grow, right, and you're going to have people capitalize on it. So. I think the motivation ideology principally is around, either finance or some kind of harm. But those are
yeah.
typically what we end up seeing. Um, but why do you think hackers? So let's talk about hackers organization, right? I mean, Anonymous is it had a really interesting model around how it was organized, which
Sure.
also preserved its ability to function, right? And also, so yeah, we should talk about, because that the organizational models have evolved, right? What we see today is vastly different. We know of attack groups that have call centers, right? So if you do get ransomware, there's 800 phone numbers that you can call, and emails and chat sessions. So maybe talk a little bit about, if you can, the anonymous organization, and from what you saw back then to what you're thinking you see now.
Yeah, well, I gotta give you guys like I would say hacker group history lesson here. Make it real quick. So even before Anonymous, you had groups that were well organized. You had groups like the Cult of Dead Cow, right? Some of you may remember those guys. They were pretty broad. They were expanded around the globe, but they all kind of had a shared mission. They weren't necessarily a threat actor group, right? But they were a research-oriented, research-first group. After Cult of Dead Cow, you had groups like Woo Woo and ADM, Team Tesso, and then of course you had LSDPL out of Poland. LSD stands for Last Stage of Delirium. And what's interesting about these guys is very similar to what John just told you about. There was a conference where people would go and share exploits. All of the groups I just mentioned were identifying vulnerabilities, developing or doing research and development and exploitation. They were creating proof of concept, fully functional exploits, and then they would have distribution, and they would share and trade with each other. Um, all of those guys, by the way, are in the security industry. Some of them are CEOs. You may even rub shoulders with them at conferences. They're all very smart folks. They weren't necessarily out there to do bad. Now, with Anonymous, it was interesting because, at least for me, I already had the experience of running in those kind of groups because I was with Hackwise and Fear the Beer and Pure Elite before I got into Anonymous, much later on in my life. What I found interesting with Anonymous is that the way the group is approached is more like a concept. Anybody in this call could be anonymous, and you could all each individually run your own campaigns or your own operations. All right. And depending on the success of the operation, you could claim it under anonymous. And then you would have people take over your operation once you're ready to retire. Remember, there were some folks that wanted to protest the Church of Scientology. And then once the Church of Scientology sites got hacked, those same people said, no, I'm going to move on. You guys could continue. And that's what made Anonymous effective in a way. But it was a double-edged sword because it also invited, since it was anonymous and anyone could participate, Anonymous was completely infiltrated with FBI agents and special agents and spooks and everybody else. Everybody you can imagine in the sun from every government was involved in Anonymous. And you could even say that some of the anonymous operations were probably spearheaded by a foreign government. Okay, I know of at least 2 stories where I know 2 operations were spearheaded by government agents. Now, let's fast forward a little bit, right? Ransomware groups. With the advent of cryptocurrency, now there was the potential to actually get money out of this ecosystem or this crime or criminal ecosystem. Before crypto, a lot of the scams and hacks that were taking place was you would have an attacker compromise a website. In those days, we didn't, a lot of websites didn't use Stripe or they didn't use PayPal for charges. They would actually store the credit card themselves and charge the credit cards. So if you were an attacker, you would break into a website, steal 10,000 credit cards, go on IRC, which is a kind of a communications medium, and find someone that was willing to buy it from you. And they would either send you the money cash or PayPal or something else, right? And even that was super risky. But as victims started paying the ransoms, some of these criminal individuals, some of these criminals in general, were like, wait, we can look at this as more as a business. And I could assure you, at the very least, that some of those ransomware operators in the very beginning probably had ties to organized crime or other syndicates or other areas of interest here. And they started gathering ideas and absorbing ideas from those organized crimes or different groups. That's what I know. That's what I've seen from some of the folks I've spoken to. A lot of these groups also originate out of, Eastern Europe, right? Which again also leads credence to the idea that maybe some of these groups may have been either mentored or supported financially by organized crime. But now remember, once one group does that, guess what? Every other group, including noobs, newbies, neophytes, script kiddies, they're gonna say, wait, I want to replicate that. If these guys are putting in $50 million a year, I would like to do that as well. So what do we need? Well, we need We need malware. We need a way to distribute the malware. We need to create an affiliate system. Okay. We need to be able to handle payments securely and as anonymous as possible. We need a way to cash out the cryptocurrencies. And then we need to be able to have some sort of support system because someone somewhere needs to talk to a victim in order to provide them the keys or a tool to decrypt their files. Now, you're probably wondering, well, why would the ransomware operators even care about support? Well, if the first 10 victims pay and they cannot decrypt their files, and that's all over the news, the next 20 victims are not going to pay either, or they're not going to pay outright. And so the whole concept of ransomware as a service is effectively dead. So you want to maintain that ecosystem. You want to do right by your victims, unfortunately. It's weird to say that, but that's how these guys are operating.
Yeah, I think that the infrastructure you're describing is extremely interesting, right? When you think about it, and there has to be somebody who's helped fund the initial investments, probably, which is
Exactly.
probably organized crime, right? But we see, I mentioned things like 800 numbers or chat sessions. I mean, one of the things we've seen over the past several years is people recruiting off of Western European colleges, right? And
Mm,
offering people salaries and signing bonuses, incentives, right?
yep.
And so it's very much become a business. And I think when we think about the advantage is they're very well organized. They have access to amazing tool sets, or they can get their
Mm,
hands on. But probably most importantly is the mindsets, right? They can,
mm,
when we take out the newbies and the script kiddies, the people that are doing this are very intelligent people, right? They're certainly not, you know, I think the image that we always have, and maybe some of you on the call have seen me do this, is I put up a what's your typical hacker look like or attacker, and everybody thinks it's the kid or in their parents' basement, who's
not
anti.
anymore.
Not anymore, right? I mean, there's some of that, but that's 10%, right? Now it's people in, they're going to office buildings, right? In Eastern European countries, and they've got vacations and benefits, and it's very organized, very, very organized. So, all right, so let's keep going.
Before you
Look,
jump past that, John, we did have a question. How much does the threat of prosecution affect threat actors? And what are your thoughts on the effect on that in areas where extradition is not permitted?
That's a great question. And John, if you don't mind, I'll jump into this because I had a great conversation with my co-host about this topic. He's former FBI, so he has some good knowledge on this. And plus, we've spoken to folks like Jeffrey Carr, who's very heavily involved in Ukraine right now when the cyber operations. A lot of these big ransomware operator groups are out of Russia. And right now, Russia and the United States are not too friendly. You saw what we had to deal with the Brittany Griner exchange not that long ago. They wanted everything under the sun just for her. That's not even including the former military guy that's I think still stuck in Russia. So yeah, we're not in good terms with Russia, and they have zero obligations to want to extradite anybody from their country, especially if they're ransomware operators. Why? Because the ransomware operators are not targeting Russian infrastructure or Russian assets or Russian clients, or there is an agreement, whether it's official or not. And let's keep it. Let's assume it's unofficial. There is some sort of agreement that says, okay, you guys can operate as you will, just don't burn down the planet and don't attack Russian assets. Now, because of that, these groups operate almost freely. All right, and that's definitely a shame because we're going to continue to see this moving forward. Now, in the event that there is a global World War III, cyber will be a part of that. I'm sure John could agree with that. Cyber will be a part of it. And those same ransomware operators that are getting basically that umbrella protection in Russia will probably help the Russians during whatever conflict. Okay. Now, something that John said very interesting a moment ago before you asked the question, Laura. These guys, they're walking around in suits, they're traveling, they're opening up businesses from the money they're gaining from victims. They're basically earning through these ransomware operations. We know for a fact they like to vacation, they like to travel. Why? Because the ransomware operators that we've been able to arrest, for some reason, like to go to Spain or France, and that's where they get extradited from. Okay? I think they're going to learn not to travel to Spain anymore Because as soon as they land in Spain, they're heading back to the United States. Okay, John.
Yeah, no, I mean, so just to give you guys some perspective on ransomware return on investment. So I think on average, we've been finding that it's about a 1,400% return on investment, right? It's some big money. So it does, when you get to that level and you're that organized, people do try to play the lifestyle, and they're going to go to Spain and south of France. And there was an arrest, I think, 9 months ago in Miami, and a few people got picked up, right? And it makes you wonder, like, why in God's name would you go to Miami or any of these countries where you have extradition treaties with? And it's because they like to live the life that they're able to achieve through that type of activity. So anyway, yeah. So I think that I think everything. Yeah, Hector and I rarely ever disagree on these things. So ultimately, as long as the motivation is there for money, as long as you have countries, and it's not just Russia, right? You have North Korea, you have Pakistan, you've got Iran, China to a large extent, even if it's just behind the scenes. You got some countries in South America. As long as they allow this to occur, there's the threat or the fear of prosecution is going to be very low. We do see it here in the U.S. Some people become silly and decide they're going to try it and don't realize that they're going to probably get caught. But if you're overseas, the threat of being arrested, unless you go to Miami, Spain, or France, or you're not going to, nothing's going to happen to you. And here's something else. In many of these countries, if you take 10%, 20% of your earnings and you kind of donate that to the local government, there's even less chance of you getting in any kind of trouble. So there's that as well. Any other questions, Laura, or thoughts?
There's one more, but I think I'll hold it until you get to that section.
Okay. So, I'll throw some of these out there, but I'll give my impression, and then Hector can jump in on these. So, are any targets taboo? I think Hector covered some of this. There used to be a time when there were taboo targets. You just didn't do certain things. I think that's not the case anymore. I think you can find at least some outfit or some group or some person that is open to attacking anything, whether there's an ideological cause, it's for notoriety or money. I think that world has changed, and again, that's why I kind of prefer the word attacker, because they are attacking. They're not just stumbling on things or trying to improve or right or wrong. But Hector, what do you think? Is there anything you think today in this world taboo?
No, even when ransomware first started gaining traction, I remember there was an attack against, I think, the NIH or some health organization, and the ransomware group immediately retracted. They gave the free decryption tool to the organization and said, "No, we apologize. That was a mistake. We would never attack a hospital." Well, since then, every ransomware operator is hitting hospitals, because hospitals, at the end of the day, or healthcare providers, are for-profit organizations or corporations, at least here in the United States. So they probably will pay, and these guys now know that. It's a shame. I don't think there's any taboo targets, right? Before it used to be, don't touch the government, don't touch healthcare, don't touch critical infrastructure. That's all open. So long as there's some sort of money or there's a political gain, is out there. Okay. Let's look at an example here. So when you look at operators out of Russia, North Korea, and China, they're probably using the same tools, same methodologies. These operators may even know each other on QQ chat and WeChat, and they might even talk with IRC sometimes, or maybe they don't like each other at all. But here's the thing: they're using the same techniques and tools and procedures and tactics, but their interests are different. For example, from the last 100 threat intel reports I've read from Chinese specific operations, they are breaking into systems for the purpose of maintaining long-term persistence, and they want intellectual property and information on people with security clearances, right? And that's just scratching the surface. The Chinese actors are working with a very specific, interest in mind. When you look at North Korean actors, they're just trying to raise money, right? I've yet to see like a specific North Korean, like a specific political attack, and I'm sure there's at least a couple of them, but most of their compromises are financially motivated. And the Russians are 50-50. Some of it is we want to gain intel, and a lot of it is we need to raise some cash for caviar and yachts. I mean, it's very interesting, but yeah, going back to what John said, I don't think there's anything off limits anymore.
Yeah, I'm actually going to build on some of the stuff that Hector just talked about, and maybe go take us down a Jason Bourne path here a little bit. So, talking about China, and just to give everybody a kind of a real and deep understanding of the sophistication of some of these attacks and what they're doing. And this also talks to the next piece of like, does an organization size matter? I don't think anybody's looking at size, right? They're looking at is the value of the data or the value of the organization as part of a broader campaign, right? So let's build on that Chinese long-term persistence stuff. So there was an attack several years ago where several attacks. One attack was done, it was by a group called Deep Panda, and out of China, and it went after an insurance, a healthcare insurer by the name of Wellfleet. It was one of the largest breaches for healthcare data, I think, till this day. So they hit that target, took a ton of data, personal health information. Then there was a target hit, which was the Marriott and Hilton hotel chains, and they went after all of the data in both of those instances, and all the records related to hotel stays. And then they hit airline travel reservations. And it was kind of interesting because these things don't seem connected, but to give you guys an idea of how much thought goes behind this and what goes on, there was a couple reasons that we later realized why they did what they did. So the first reason was, why did they go after the insurer? Well, the reason they went after the insurer, and by the way, in none of these cases was the data ever sold or appeared in the black market to the best of anybody's knowledge. The reason they went after the insurer was the insurer actually was the major underwriter for the U.S. Senate and Congress, right? So they had the records, the healthcare records of all senators and congressmen, and they could now use that to exploit things, right? So if you had a senator who maybe visited a hospital for an STD, maybe you don't want that to get out, or maybe they had an addiction problem, right? So now you're seeing them take the data and analyze it, not just try to exploit it in terms of, hey, give me money, but analyze the data. With the Hilton and the travel reservations, the reason they went after those, and this is kind of a freaky situation, is they started to correlate the data to when they knew U.S. spies were in certain countries. So they had targeted and knew certain U.S. spies, and then they would look at where those spies were staying, what hotels they were staying in, and then they would look at their own people in China and figure out where they were traveling to and where they were staying for quote unquote vacations or time off. And whenever they saw that intersection between a US spy and a Chinese operative in the same town, same time, same place over a period of time, they started to just assume that their person was a double agent. And there were at least 3 or 4 people who disappeared based on that data analysis. So, when we talk about things like taboo and organization size, when we're talking nation states, is a very, very different game, and the end game is typically long-term persistence. There's a lot of concern right now that many of our critical infrastructure systems may have been breached over the past 5 to 7 years, and if something were to kick off, that we could very much be fighting an internal battle, right, as opposed to an external infiltration if there were a war. So the landscape is pretty sophisticated, and again, once those tools and techniques get out, they can be used by anybody. Another thing I'll build on with what Hector said, and this is something why attackers have the advantage. Let's say you guys on the call have an issue with Active Directory, right? You run into a bug. So what do? You open a support ticket. Maybe there's a forum or 2 that you can go to, but pretty much you're at the mercy of your own skills to figure out what to do about Active Directory. And maybe, hopefully, Microsoft or whoever the vendor is will respond and point you in the right direction or do something. So let's contrast that to either Hector or me running into a problem with an exploit we're trying to do. I can, or he can, or anybody can, it's nothing to do with who we are, can post that exploit and say, hey, has anybody got any ideas on how I can get this to the next level? I'm running into this issue or that issue. And to Hector's point, I can get people from Pakistan, North Korea, China. We may not like each other, but the moment you put that out there, you are going to get people trying to optimize that exploit for you. And that kind of collaboration is really dangerous, right? Because it accelerates the ability as a community to take on and create attacks. And then after you optimize it, everybody goes back to their corner and begins to hate each other again. But you work together, right? And that's a very serious advantage. So let's keep moving on. Laura, any other questions or?
We have one related to targeting. Has the value of medical patient data grown in the eyes of hackers? And have you seen ransomware deployments targeting patient data specifically?
So well, so what we have seen change, at least in my view of how what we're seeing ransomware evolve. It used to be for a while that ransomware was very immediate, right? You clicked on something, you downloaded something, and the attack took off. And then they locked everything up and you paid. And that still happens today. So I don't want to say we shouldn't defend against that. But what I've been seeing lately is more of a persistent threat. So the attackers get into your environment through phishing, vishing, or some other exploit, and now they recon your environment. And they start learning what you have in the environment. They're basically conducting a covert pen test. And they catalog what you have. And this could take 3, 4, 5 months, right? This isn't, I think one of the big misconceptions about a lot of defenders is that things happen immediately. And reality is, if you really want to go after somebody, you're going to take your time, remain covert, and establish that foothold and that long-term persistence. And we're seeing that more with ransomware, where it's almost become a custom attack. So when the attack does kick off, they know where your patient data is. They've already infected and infiltrated your backup systems over weeks, or if not months. They already know where they've already established their foothold or sampled data. I don't know of anything that is specifically targeting just patient data. Usually when they go after an organization, they're going to take out the entire organization. But I guess the difference I'm seeing is it's being done over a period of time. What I try to say is attackers don't have to deliver results by end of the quarter, right? They're not they don't have a sales target or a revenue target or a cost optimization. They can take their time. It's just a matter of patience for them, and not getting discovered. So I don't know, Hector, if you got thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great point that you made. So if we were to dissect the I would say the average ransomware group as they are today, there are people working in the marketing section and support section, malware and research and development section. But there's one thing that I found interesting, and that is that these ransomware operators or ransomware as a service groups don't even need to hack anymore. They don't need to do any sort of hacking, because what ends up happening is they're subcontracting or hiring what they call IABs, or initial access brokers, or initial entry specialists, depending on who you speak to in the security industry. They have a different terminology for it. But basically, it's the person that initially broke into the provider or the victim's network, right? That person, and here's what's interesting about that. There's a lot of very talented hackers out there, and they're doing those IAB or initial entry jobs kind of like a side job, like a part-time job, a part-time gig. They'll do 3 or 4 a week. They'll get 1,500 or 2,000 per hack. They're pretty happy. They're doing pretty good. And what those guys do is once they kind of get into a system, they'll set some persistence. They'll set some backdoors. They'll crack some passwords so they're living off the land. They're using a user accounts as front doors into a network, not a back door. And then they're passing that or selling it to a ransomware group. Now, the reason why we know that's a thing is because I've seen at least, threat intel reports from Mandiant and other groups like Kaspersky, where they have logs from the beginning of the entry all the way until the encryption. And what you're seeing is in the initial entry logs, sophisticated, they know what they're doing. There's no typos. They have the commands pretty much automated, or at least, they know exactly what to run and when to run and how to identify something without triggering a CrowdStrike Falcon, for example. I know at least one of you have that. And then when the threat intel providers in the report, you start looking at what happens after the initial entry, you see typos, and like the most obvious things are happening, like usernames are added to domain that shouldn't be added if you are an attacker trying to keep quiet. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting things taking place in how ransomware operations take place, and even the process, the methodology is really bugged out. So I guess one of the points I want to kind of convey here is that not only are you dealing with these businessmen type of people that are looking to monetize your vulnerability, you're also dealing with highly specialized initial entry experts who have probably been hacking for quite some time, probably on my level. And then you have people that have no business being inside of an internal network, but they're just running basically commands off of a script, right? So you're dealing with a large sample of different attackers with different methodologies and capabilities. And sometimes, and I know we're going to get into this, John, sometimes it becomes very difficult to defend against that. Because now not only are the attackers using zero-day exploits now, right? You saw Move It a couple weeks ago. You saw the Barracuda exploits, the Fortinet exploits, right? Not only are they using 0 days, they're using 1 days. They're using social engineering. They're identifying vulnerabilities in password management tools and platforms. They're identifying vulnerabilities or using techniques like MFA fatigue and exhaustion, right? They have this whole arsenal of different tools and different ways to get you. And they're taking their time. It's okay. In their minds, if an operation takes 6 months, and we're talking about a ransomware operator group, not like a nation state actor, right? For a ransomware operator group, if sure it took us 6 months to get paid, that's fine. We're going to charge them 25 mil. $25 million for 6 months of sitting around and waiting for the right moment is pretty good for them.
Yeah, it makes me wonder why I don't relocate to Bora Bora. Um, so I think part of this, I think we should try to evolve this a little bit. Is when we think of attacks, and I think a lot of defenders do. You think about one attack, right? That you're going to defend against denial of service. That's one I hear about all the time. Like, well, can you detect denial of service? And I think one of the things, like when Hector was just talking about, is attackers are getting better and better at chaining things together, right? And that's really important, because one of the things we're seeing, in fact, I was just at a conference and somebody said that happened to me, is patch management, right? So most organizations will manage the highs or criticals and maybe the mediums when it comes to patching, because you've got so many things going on. You're just like, okay, I'll patch the highs and the criticals. I'll try to get to the mediums when I can. Chances are you'll never get to the low. And so when we start thinking about that sophisticated attacker, that person who's really a craftsman at the skill set, they're going to chain together those lows, right? And those lows usually aren't going to make a lot of noise. But once they start doing that, right, it's hard to find them. You've probably left it open for them. And so now we're in a world where you really got to take a holistic view to defense, right? You got to think about, if you're leaving your lows unpatched, what's that mean? And sometimes, just to give some defensive advice, I know everybody's out there trying to plug every hole. One technique you can think of, if you're limited on resources, figure out what the most critical things are in your environment. What are those things that you really absolutely can't live without? Probably a domain controller, your EMR, your electronic medical record, maybe your scheduling system, maybe your finance system. What are those 4 or 5 things? Don't pick more than 4 or 5, because then you'll break down this advice. Go figure out how to lock those down, right? Put a policy or a procedure in place that says, no matter what, we're going to keep those things fully patched. We're going to make sure they're completely secure. They all have MFA on those. And yeah, we may not be able to get to everything in our environment, right? An attacker, you may not be able to patch every endpoint. But if you have the most critical stuff locked down, then at least if something happens, it's going to minimize that risk to you. So building on this attack thing, so we all hear about pen testing, and there's a variety of different types, external, internal, application pen testing. And so one thing we don't talk about a lot, and I don't see a lot in healthcare, is red team testing. We've done a few, for several organizations in the healthcare space, but not a lot, right? When you think about how many hospitals there are, red teaming is not something we see a lot of. And I will say that, yeah, there's probably a certain level of maturity you want to achieve to do red teaming. But I think, Hector, maybe, talk a little bit about what's the difference between red teaming and the experience there versus, let's just say, a normal pen test that we would run.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, that's a great question. And there's so many different variables here that come into play. So as you guys know, a vulnerability assessment is essentially just a scan And it's just a very cursory overview assessment of potential vulnerabilities within your environment. All right, and we're going to stick to internal. Now, once you bring in pen testers or penetration testers, they're still going to go through the vulnerability assessment. They're still doing that. But now they're validating these vulnerabilities. They're trying to identify a potential attack path, right? So we move the potential line slightly over. Validation of vulnerabilities, identifying whether or not those vulnerabilities can be used or leveraged in furtherance of an attack. And then usually, depending on the pen testing team, once they have a proof of concept, once they validate the results, they move on to the next. All right. And it all depends on scoping. That's why it says a lot of variables. Depends on scoping, depends on timing. If you hire a pen testing company and say, hey, we have 5,000 assets internally and 2,500 employees, and we have one Active Directory or domain, and we have 60 different domain controllers spread across 60 offices. And yeah, we can only afford to pay you for a week of work, or we have the budget, but we only have a window of 5 days for you to do the work, right? It's not going to be effective, and your pen tester is probably not going to get through a lot. That's the reality of it, okay? For a network that size, if they're using Nessus or they're using some other commercial tool to help them speed it up, Nessus is still going to take 2 or 3 days to scan 5,000 assets, unless you want to burn your network, right? Now, red teams. Red teams are interesting because red team engagements, they come from the military. For those of you that have military experience, you probably have heard the term, or even participated in a red team in your life. You have the blue team, red team, and in some countries you have the tiger team. I think the Army has our tiger team as well. The tiger team is kind of like a purple team. They both work together, both sides, defensive and offensive. Now, in the case of an internal assessment or internal red team, it's objective based, right? It's highly targeted, highly specific, okay? Depending on some more variables, is it a fully black box red team? Is there some leeway? Can I get a domain admin credential to start for the audit? Depending on variables, what you're gonna have is an adversary, right? Someone that you hired as an adversary to come into your network and try to identify realistic attack paths that would lead to objectives, all right? Those objectives are also called crown jewels. So if you ever hear the word crown jewels discussed in the pen test report or something, that's what the reference is. Here's what I learned, John. Maybe it'll kind of touch on what your concern is. Not a lot of healthcare providers or hospitals are doing red team engagements. A lot of the clients that we kind of we kind of sell on the red team, like, hey, pen testers are great. We could do a red team for you, right? Or whatever. They don't know what objectives to target. They don't know what it is that's so sensitive in their environment that's going to be a deal breaker for them. For example, you mentioned the financial system, scheduling system, EMR, right? Maybe a PHI MS SQL database that stores everything, right? Some of these organizations, including healthcare, do not really know the importance of those systems. So when we're having a discussion on red team engagements, I'm like, okay, let's define some objectives. They're like MFA, right? And that's not to down the organ. I'm not admonishing them, but I think that a lot of security programs are really not mature yet. They haven't reached the point for a red team engagement. That's the reality.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I would say, so if you're listening to this, you're thinking about what do I do next? How do I take things to the next level? Think about a red team, but you have to have that. Basically what you're doing, is giving the pen testing team a mission. Can you get to my medical devices? Can you get to my EMR? Those are kind of the objectives you want. So it's not like go figure out everything you can and come back to me with this report of 1,000 things. Maybe you break it into phases. Phase 1, go run a vulnerability scan and a lightweight internal pen test. Phase 2, go do a red team test. And could somebody get to those crown jewels, right? Because again, it goes back to how do you defend that? If those are your 5 or 6 things you think are your crown jewels, what can you do to defend them and make sure they're the most hardened things in the environment? So just something to think about. Laura, any other questions or thoughts?
There's one. What are the most common mistakes that healthcare organizations or medical device manufacturers make that inadvertently help hackers?
Ooh, that's a big question with a lot of answers. We
Well,
talked about some of them, but go
yeah,
ahead.
I'll start from the pen tester side because remember, John's on the flip side. He's more on the defensive, and he has better experience on that front. From the pen tester side, I can tell you exactly what helps me when I'm doing a pen test or red team. When a healthcare provider brings in third-party vendor appliances, and the vendor manages those appliances, but those appliances are on the healthcare provider's internal network, and there's no VLAN segmentation, and the healthcare provider and security team have no control over policy or compliance on that device, and those devices are running Linux kernel 2.4 from 15 years ago. And they're running SSH with Telnet and a whole bunch of services and web servers with PHP that are at least another 15 years old. The point is, I've seen more of that um, as a big problem than um, you know, and I'm being as realistic as I can. Even with smaller healthcare providers, I've seen it. They've done okay with asset management. Not the best, but I've seen okay. But third-party vendors are essentially, from my perspective, as the bad guy, um, an open gateway to everything else. There are no controls in most cases that I've seen, and even I would even say that I've worked on maybe the top, 100 hospitals in the country, or some of those, and even those guys are dealing with the same problem: third-party vendor appliances. That's just my take, John.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I agree with you. I think that there's a few things from the attacker's perspective. I think most organizations don't respect the audacity of the attacker, right? So many times, and you and I have done engagements together where people have said, well, nobody would do that, right? We just did one recently in California where people were like, well, you know, that would never happen, or you can't do that. And I think that's a first thing you need to keep in mind is, attackers are tenacious. They have a lot of capabilities to try different things, and again, time is their friend. On the defensive side, I think that you really, first of all, don't put your faith in tools that are dated, right? So I hear a lot of times, oh, well, we have a SIM, or we're looking at a SIM. Like a SIM is like 15, 20 years old at this time. And even Hector talked about, like, when you see some of the nation state stuff or some of the more advanced ransomware operators or the infiltration specialists and things like that, they're very covert. They know how to clean up their tracks. They know what's going to trigger a log entry that's going to look suspicious, right? So they're going to hide with. I mean, here's the thing. Again, maybe this goes back to respecting the attacker and the audacity of the attacker. Attackers know what's going to set off an alarm, right? They know what's going to make noise. And so they will remain under that threshold. And so if you have tools that are expecting that kind of nefarious activity, you're going to catch script kiddies and you'll catch a lot of people. But for those advanced persistent threats, you've got to really modernize your tool set. And ultimately try not to do everything, right? Try, again, go back to this concept of figure out your crown jewels, get them hardened, get them protected, and then after you have that done, figure out the next layer and the next layer. Sometimes board members will ask me, what's the question that I should ask my IT security team to know if we're secure or not? And the question I always tell board members to ask is ask your IT security team if you would be okay with a no rules of engagement pen test, anything goes. And if the answer to that question is no, then ask, well, why not? And whatever you give as a reason for why not, those are the things you need to go secure. Because if you're scared that a pen tester or attacker is going to take down your EMR, then you need to figure out why and go fix that, right? So that's an easy way to think about where should you focus your attention from a defensive perspective. So hopefully that's helpful to you guys. Any other questions, Laura? Or
That's good for now.
we started talking about this a little bit about remaining covert. Um, you know, thoughts about catching an attacker early, and one of the things I'll throw in here, and this is probably a selfless plug, is honeypots, right? We do a lot more in the Nightingale platform. We're doing a network intrusion and host intrusion, but honeypots, the thing about them, especially level ones that are not trying to analyze or trap the attacker, they are a huge kind of litmus as to what's happening in your network, right? Because if attacker's moving around the network, it doesn't matter how slow or fast they're moving. If they hit a honeypot, and that sets off an alert, right? It's not trying to analyze them. It's just going to say, hey, somebody touched me. You now have a heads up that something is happening in your network, right? You may need to dive into logs now and do other threat hunting, but you now at least know somebody's in the network. With that, I would tell you, be very careful of what you classify as a false positive. I have a rule, or when I'm teaching people incident response or analytics or threat hunting, is that there's no such thing as a false positive, right? If something's happening in your environment, it's either because it's misconfigured, which is ultimately going to be a security issue, or there's something really happening and you need to understand why. But I guess, Hector, what thoughts do you have in terms of, hey, what, I guess a different way to ask this is, what scares you? Like, what don't you want to find on a network to allow you the freedom of movement?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. If you were to ask me that question 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when I was the real bad guy, right? My concern would be live employees, employees that were working at that moment. Um, Especially, I was breaking into Unix systems, and if you're any of you are familiar, if you're using Unix from the console, all you have to type is W, and you'll see someone is logged into the server, right? Or you type in PSAUX, and you see all the processes. So even if you hide yourself from W, or who's on, you can see the processes to kind of identify. Oh, there's something weird going on in the system. So as soon as I logged into a machine and I saw there was someone that was active, I would be like, okay, I need to sign off and just play dead, right? Now it's different because I'm going in assuming that there's SIM. I'm assuming there's an EDR somewhere. I'm going to assume that that there are technical controls in place to try to mitigate some of my lateral movement. Okay. Now, where it becomes scary for me is when there is kind of like a live SOC rapid response team service. I know you guys do some stuff like that. There's some services out there where they have like a rapid recovery. If an indicator of compromise is identified, then the SOC team will automatically sandbox the machine from the network. I've been caught by those doing red team engagements, and within 5 minutes tops max, the machine is offline. Now everybody that needs to know knows that there is a possible intrusion and there's an incident response. That is the deal breaker for me. Is either make the engagement or break it for me. If I'm able to circumvent that, assuming it exists, then I'm Gucci. I am good, right? I could continue hacking and go from there. But if I identify one of those services are active and they identify that I executed the wrong command on the wrong system, then that's a problem. Absolutely.
Cool. Laura, any other questions?
There's a question about AI and how it's being used as the next level hacking tools, and what are some countermeasures?
Yeah, it's a whole conversation in and of itself, but yeah, I'll throw some.
Conversation.
Yeah, that's like another hour. It's a great question. I mean, I'll tell you some of the things that I'm seeing and some things I'm playing with, and let Hector chime in. So, we're seeing a lot around deep fakes, especially voice, big for social engineering. We're seeing AI applied to developing really targeted phishing emails, right? Where we're seeing AI analyze people's LinkedIn profiles, social media profiles, and then generate a very specific phishing email to that person, or analyze things like partner testimonials or case studies on partner websites and then use that to craft it. So we're seeing kind of that whole social engineering, um, category of attacks really evolve because of AI, especially ChatGPT. It's just so easy, right? You can go to ChatGPT. You guys can all try this. Go to ChatGPT, give it a few pieces of information about somebody, and tell it to write an email and a phishing email. Say you want to conduct a phishing test, and ChatGPT will do that. But it's getting beyond that. Like, again, it goes back to money. And we have attack groups that are setting up their own instances of OpenAI's engine, right? So I'll tell you some of the things I'm working on. So one is genetic algorithms, where basically you generate the ability to go out and attempt different types of attacks, based on what the genetic algorithms learn. Whatever attack has got the most opportunity for success, it survives, the other ones shut down, and then you can kind of grow from there. So it's basically applying bots, but with intelligence, right? Where it's survival of the fittest. So that's kind of some of the stuff there. Hector, what are you thinking on this?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. If you're asking from the attacker's perspective, they will go in the direction that John has laid out, right? For a long time, adversaries or attackers would use bots, automated bots that would scan the internet with a very specific service or a very specific response or a very specific version. And depending on the version, depending on the service, depending on the response, depending on different factors, it'll either exploit or log a potential vulnerability or ignore non-vulnerable targets. And they've been dumb. They're dumb bots. They're very simple, straightforward. A good friend of mine, Andrew Morris, created a platform called Gray Noise. John, you've met Andrew. And if you just go to his website at any moment, go to Gray Noise at any moment of the day, he's tracking a whole new botnet, a whole new attack program or operation. It's constant 24/7, but they're noisy. They're very noisy. And sometimes they're even easy to detect. And most times they're easy to detect. So there's going to be an attacker that's going to try to approach what John has laid out here, which is, can we create an algorithm that's going to be able to smartly identify targets, minimize detection if possible, and raise the chance of successful exploitation compromising? I think that's realistic.
Yeah.
As for defensive, it's a whole different conversation.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, again, yeah, it is a bigger, and we're kind of coming to the end of the hour, but I think defense is lagging. I think we're hearing a lot of companies position themselves as being able to detect AI attacks, but I think I don't think we've seen the onslaught of attackers AI, and until we see that, we got to remember defenders are always one step behind attackers, right? We got to see what they're doing before we can figure out how to defend against it without having to, completely locking down or air gapping a network. But we haven't seen, I think, the heyday of AI-based cyber attacking yet. We're just in the infancy, and what we're seeing is pretty scary. The deep fake stuff is really good. We've got people who are taking voice samples of somebody and using that to craft entire phishing attacks. And this is just the beginning, right? I think we're going to see a lot around genetic algorithms, swarm-based attacks, especially with nation states. As we see, international, rivalries evolve, a lot of money being put into AI-based cyber attacks, and that'll leak out at some point. Any other questions, Laura?
No more questions right now.
So with that, we're kind of coming to the end. There's a couple things, just housekeeping before we sign off. So if you have questions, please post them. The next live webinar, our next CIP will be July 27th. And we're going to talk about some myths related to FDA and medical device security and things of that nature. So a lot of you have questions around, how do you patch or protect medical devices? We'll get into that on the 27th. If you go to the CIP page, you have the ability to get to all the past webinars and other resources we've posted. So please make sure you check that out. July 13th, we are going to do an overview of our CAS solution, which is our cybersecurity platform, or cybersecurity as a service. We'll go deep into that. Really, I think even if you're not in the market to purchase a new platform and new security tools, I think the way we approach security in CAS will help you think about what you think your current vendor should be doing for you. So whether you're looking to adopt a new platform or you're happy with the one you have, I think it'll be a really good learning experience. We're going to get into why we've created CAS the way we did and go through that. So with that, I don't know, Laura, any last minute questions or?
No, I don't see any more questions.
So with that, I truly want to take time to thank you, Hector, very, very much. I'm sure we'll be talking, but thank you so much for your time. I hope everybody that's attended, you got something out of this. If you do think of a question, after this and you're like, oh, I wish I would have asked that, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll do the best to get back to you as soon as we can. With that, I hope you all have an amazing 4th of July, and thank you so much for your time. Talk to you guys soon. Thank you, Hector.
Take care, guys.
Thank you.